Welcome to my YouTube, friends, family, allies, and relatives. My name is Pam Palmater, and I'm an Indigenous lawyer, professor, author, and content creator. You can find all of my content on my website, and it's pretty easy, pampalmater.com. It has my Warrior Life podcast, my Warrior Kids podcast, my Twitch streams, blogs, and YouTube videos. And today's show is going to be so awesome. And I still literally cannot believe that this guest agreed to sit down and have a chat with me. I am a huge fan of his. And I had to reach all the way overseas or across the pond or over the ocean, whatever your terminology is, just to see if he would agree to join me. And of course, he is as fantastic as a person as he is as a performer, and he agreed to do this. I'm so excited. I'm so happy to share all of this with you because we have none other than Matt Greene. And just by way of a little intro, in case there's like 10 people who don't know who he is, Matt Greene is a comedian, he's an actor, he's a writer from Yorkshire and works all over the UK and globally. For more than a decade, he's been performing on screen, radio, and on stage. And he also says that writing about himself in the third person is unsettling. And I have to agree with him. But let's welcome to the show, Matt Greene.
Hello, it's nice to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. You're like literally one of my faves. I don't think there's anybody else in the UK doing things as amazing as you. But before I start grilling you with my questions, because, I have a million questions, perhaps you'd like an opportunity just to introduce yourself and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. I'm, as you say, I've been doing comedy quite a long time. I mean, when you said a decade, that made me think, gosh, yeah, it's nearly 2 decades now. I've been doing comedy and acting and all that kind of stuff for, nearly 20 years. Stand-up comedy for about that amount of time. And it's more in the last kind of 2 or 3 years since, I guess, really since COVID, that I've started making content online. So I was making some short films and sketches and things occasionally before that, but it was never something that I spent very much time on. Whereas now I do it all the time, and I kind of worked it out during COVID. I worked out how I could make stuff from home using a fairly simple setup that I've got in my front room, which is where I am now. And it's kind of just sort of snowballed, really. Initially I started making sketches about all sorts of stuff, and then over the first sort of year or so I kind of worked out that the thing that I particularly wanted to talk about was kind of politics and what was happening in the news and in sort of the COVID stuff, and then more wider sort of political things. And then for the last kind of nearly couple of years now, I've been quite focused on satire, political sketches and commentary, and that seems to be working. People seem to be kind of connecting to it and enjoying it. And I'm part of a little gang, sort of unofficial gang. We don't all work together, but we all sort of know each other through making stuff. There's a sort of bunch of us doing that kind of thing on Twitter and YouTube and things like that. And that's been really fun. And it sort of, it still seems to be working. Still, people still enjoying it. So just that's become my sort of second career now, which is great.
My gosh, like it's just so pervasive nowadays, just in general, with online content creators and people being able to either make a living or educate people or entertain people online. And like you said, ever since like the pandemic and people were stuck at home, they couldn't even leave their homes, at least here in Canada for a certain time. If you didn't transition to online content, you're really missing out on a booming audience. And ever since, COVID started to sort of transition in some places, it's not like it's gone. It appears that the online content, job area seems to be just continuing to grow. And I think long past COVID, if it ever goes away, it's going to be a huge opportunity for people. And do you find that since that time that you've done so much online content that you've gotten a lot more followers?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's definitely made a big impact on my followers on Twitter and YouTube. I mean, I had a few on Twitter and almost none on YouTube, and now I've kind of got a few thousand on each. And it's been, I've got sort of 70 odd thousand on Twitter and 20 odd thousand on YouTube, which has been a huge, for me, a really big change in the last year or so. I mean, I think there was a point where obviously it was the same everywhere, I guess, that we were locked down completely for the first few months, and then even after that, there were a lot of restrictions involved, which meant that my normal job, my sort of stand-up live comedy job, just disappeared. Just didn't exist anymore for a few months, and we did find ways of making live shows online and did quite a lot of Zoom shows in this sort of format, which was sort of interesting and so actually quite fun in the end. We kind of worked it out, but there was still a lot of time where I didn't have anything else to do, and yeah, as you say, it was a great way of it was a great opportunity that I took, and lots of other people took, to sort of find a new way of doing things. And then obviously it's not like, I mean, obviously sketches and things have been done on YouTube for years, but it feels like the kind of a real immediacy, the real sort of responding to things in the moment as soon as they happen has become a real yeah, it's become an interesting new way of doing things. And it feels like satirical shows now on television or radio are almost behind the times, because they have to they have to record a day ahead or a couple of days ahead, and normally that's fine, but it feels like these days things move so, particularly in the UK, which has had a completely insane few months of political mayhem.
Well,
something that you make yesterday is no longer relevant today, which is crazy.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you, because, we grew up watching, sitcoms or comedy specials, or, the little tiny commentary after the news kind of thing. And sometimes it's like once a week or even less than that. But that is so incompatible with today's instantaneous society. And I was going to say, one of the things I note about you, even more than some other people on YouTube, is that you have immediate content. It's almost like as soon as you see something, instant sketch comes out, you record it and it's out. Like already you have commentary on the US elections. And I was like, oh my goodness, even before some of the political analysts have torn it apart, you're already out there saying what we all think.
So as results continue to come in from the US, it appears that the much predicted red wave was more of a puce dribble. Let's go over to our expert on American politics for more. So what happened? Well, obviously the polling was wrong, not for the first time. Indeed, in previous years the polling has underestimated the Republican vote, and this year it seems to have underestimated the Democrat vote. So does that mean that in future we should simply ignore the polls? Absolutely not, they're still very useful. In what way? They give me something to talk about. Now, yesterday you said that today would be a good day for Donald Trump, and yet many of the candidates that he supported failed. That's right, he may actually be less popular than people thought. People like you? Possibly. You also said that Democrats had focused too much on abortion rights and not enough on the economy, and would be punished by the electorate for that. Yes, that is definitely what it looked like last night. And what does it look like now? The Democrats focused exactly the right amount on abortion rights and the economy, and have been rewarded for that. Or maybe it was about something else entirely. That's also a possibility. So you got it wrong then, and you might have got it wrong now. Well, it's always difficult to predict what's going to happen in an election. And yet that's exactly what you've been doing for months. Yes, it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. Do they though? What's that? Is it actually useful to spend all of the time leading up to an election, analysing polls and making predictions, if in the end they turn out to be wrong? Well, I mean, doesn't that just lead to a narrative where one side becomes the obvious winner and it could depress turnout for the other side, and if the other side does win, then it just leads to conspiracy theories? I suppose that... Wouldn't it be better for us just to discuss the issues and the candidates, and then let the voters decide? Well, possibly, but then how would we generate drama? This is the news, not Netflix. Well, you keep booking me. Fair point. And look, I can't predict the future, but I'm great at explaining the past. So, what happens now? Trump will definitely run for president. And what if he doesn't? In that case, I'll say that it was always obvious that he wouldn't. Thank you, I think. Next up, as most unlikely night since Sir Mix-a-Lot Gavin Williamson resigns from the government for the third time, we ask, how will the crucial without portfolio department cope without him? Is he trying to win some sort of twisted game? And will he get a peerage at the end of it?
Well, thank you. That's good to know. I mean, I always feel like I'm running to stay ahead, to stay on track with things. And I think for me, partly it's a funny thing. It's a funny mix of trying to read as much news as I can bear to on news sites and on Twitter and newspapers and on the telly and stuff, but also just being aware that actually the reality is most people don't read that much news, don't see that much news. And so there's no point trying to kind of have an incredibly nuanced, detailed approach to things. You have to have a slightly more broad brush approach and see what's happening in broad terms and go for that and not get too into the weeds with it. If you're making the kind of thing I'm making, I think if you're someone like, you know, a John Oliver or someone who's able to kind of really spend weeks researching issues and really get into it, that's fantastic, and that's a whole different sort of game. But the game I'm in currently is the sort of, yeah, as you say, react to things quickly. But also, I think it's what I've learned over the last couple of years is sort of is to trust my instincts, that if I'm annoyed about something, and it usually comes from a place of annoyance, like if I'm annoyed about something or sort of confused or surprised or have some reaction to something in the news, that will resonate with other people. And for me, with the midterms, obviously, I was watching and sort of reading the news slightly with my hands over my eyes and hoping that things wouldn't be as bad as they look like they might be. And I had the thing that I've got very bored of over the last, you know, decade or so is going to bed sort of hopeful and waking up and everything's horrible, you know, and that happens with Trump, obviously, and with Brexit and you know, and other things as well. And so, you know, whenever it was a couple of days ago, I sort of went to bed feeling tense, and then woke up and looked at the news and was like, oh, it's not perfect, but it's certainly not as bad as it could have been. And what annoyed me was that sort of recognition that, yeah, the polling. And it's not that I think that the polling is somehow totally useless, but the fact that they completely overdo it, and they kind of, so much of the media is so obsessed with the story of who's up, who's down, that it does create this kind of narrative of, well, this is going to happen and this is definitely going to happen, rather than this could happen or this might happen. And I think that annoyed me. And also I think I've done a few videos about this over the last few years. I did one a couple of years ago about the elections in the UK, and I did a whole sort of sketch about all the different things that happen on election nights. And one of those things that really annoys me and continues to annoy me is pundits who just say one thing, and then when the evidence changes, just completely change their opinion without any indication that anything's changed. You know, they're like, well, this was always going to happen. Well, it hasn't happened. Well, that was always going to happen. And it's sort of, well, hang on, what are you talking about? Why are you not being challenged on that? Why are you not being asked to justify your opinion? So that was what that idea immediately came to me, and so I thought, okay, I can make something about that. I don't have to know all of the detail of all the different races and exactly who's up and down, but I can definitely make something about that specific feeling.
Well, there's so much general, and I think, you know, also riding the trend of social media and online content, you know, it's getting shorter and shorter, with some exceptions. Obviously, TV shows, you might have to watch the analysis for half an hour, 20 minutes, an hour, and maybe everyone doesn't want to do that, or they're doing everything at the same time. It must be quite a challenge to put the main points, but in a 2-minute comedic parody, you know.
Yeah,
because there's pros and cons to that, in terms of, geez, what's going to be the most important? I only have 2 minutes to do this.
oh, definitely. I mean, in some ways, Twitter's been good for me on that score, because Twitter has a limit of 2 minutes 20 on videos, unless you know, pay Elon Musk or whatever. It's not clear now whether that's true or not. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with that? But up until recently, 2 minutes 20 was very much the limit, unless you were a sort of advertiser or whatever. But what I found is that I feel like that's about right for these sorts of sketches, that about 2 minutes 20 feels about the amount of time where you can get to the point, and then you can get out and you can leave with a punchline. And if you try and do a much longer sketch, it can sort of get a bit bogged down, and you then have to think a lot more about the structure of it and how you're going to grab an audience and really take them with you. And that's something that I think, if you look at sketch comedy on TV, so many sketches are just too long. You know, they're too long because, and I know why. It's because, practically speaking, sketch comedy is very expensive if you're doing it on telly, because you have to constantly change location and change setups and everything. And so they want to make as much as they can out of each sketch, and so they kind of really cram a lot of stuff in. And I just think that the internet is a place where you don't have to do that. You know, you can be like, I've got a green screen and I'm just going to make sketches, which are, you know, I make them look as nice as I can, but within limits. And so I know I don't have the capacity to have loads of props and costumes and all that kind of stuff. And so what I'm really focusing on, is the point. What point am I trying to make? What's the kind of what's the basic sort of point of the sketch? And then 2 minutes tends to work for that. And the other advantage I have is that I'm just doing it for me. Like I'm not working for anyone. I'm not working for a TV show or radio show. I mean, I have people who support me on Ko-fi and they buy things for me or donate for me or whatever, and that's lovely, and I really appreciate that. But I don't think of them as I think of them as my supporters rather than the people who sort of are owning own the content. And so if I look at the news one day and I think, do you know what? I don't think there's anything in today's news that I love the idea of making a sketch about. I just don't have to. I can wait, and there'll always be something else will come along at some point. Whereas, and I think that is another thing that I think that the sort of the more kind of traditional TV, radio, topical comedy, satirical stuff can suffer from a bit. Is that, well, this week the stories are ABC, so we have to do jokes about ABC, and maybe those stories aren't that interesting, or maybe those stories have already had a billion jokes about them. So if you if you're going to kind of talk about that again, then everyone's going to be like, oh, okay, we've already heard about this. Whereas I'm allowed to go, do you know what? This week I'm just going to talk about this or that or the other, and I don't have to talk about the big story unless I think I've got an angle on it.
Yeah. And that's also really good information and advice for people who are considering where to put their content, where to put their, artistic efforts or entertainment or educational efforts, because you think about two things. One, like Saturday Night Live. We used to love it. It used to be so funny. I used to love watching that. But there were some skits that you were like, okay, like it's already been funny. Now you're just like stretching it out. And I love that the whole world has changed in that sense. And then the other point that you were talking about was you're doing it for you. And I don't know that in the entertainment or even media or educational industry that there has been so much freedom to post when we want, how we want, about what we want. We can say anything we want, apparently. Not that that's good for, some people, but it's like the freedom, and so the pressure's not there in the same way where you would have to do whatever the TV station is saying or whatever the movie is saying. And I think that just it brings out even more creativity in people. And I was kind of wondering, like, how do you find the difference between, say, stand-up comedy, which you have to do like a whole show, versus these little quick one-off, like 2-minute parodies of, what's happening in the US or Boris Johnson or, whoever else is the target of the day?
Yeah. I mean, they are very different. I mean,
Mhm.
stand-up is much more obviously to an audience and a specific audience who is sitting in front of you, and so you have to play the room to an extent. You have to talk to those people in that room, and if that audience aren't particularly interested in something you're saying, you have to find a way of either making them interested or switch to a different perspective. I do a lot of comparing, which involves a lot of audience interaction and talking to the audience and bringing them in and finding fun stuff in the audience and all that kind of stuff. And that's much more improvisational, much more ad-lib, dependent on what's going on in that specific space. And so, I mean, for me at the moment, my comedy is quite split between stand-up, which is quite sort of by definition has to be broader, has to have a more sort of consistent hit rate of, well, most people who go out to a comedy club aren't necessarily wanting to think about politics. They're not necessarily wanting to think about what happened in the news today. In fact, quite a lot of the time, it's a very common experience for someone who does sort of topical or political comedy that you talk about something that happened in the news that day, and half the audience or more haven't heard about it because they're not on Twitter all the time like I am, and they're not and they're not reading the newspaper on their way to the gig. They're just living their lives. And so if you talk about something, unless it's absolutely huge, unless it's a story that nobody could possibly have missed, then most people will just not get it. And so weirdly, topical comedy in the stand-up club is often there's almost like a delay effect where you have to wait a few days or even a week for stories to sort of percolate into people's brains, and then you can start talking about them. But by then, the story has got to be big enough that it's still interesting. Because if you talk about something that happened a week ago, but it's just like a little thing, then people are like, well, why are you talking about this? So for me, stand-up, my stand-up is much less topical, much less political. I have chunks of political and topical material in it, but I'm always careful to kind of wrap that in more sort of traditional observational material, stories, jokes, improvisation, so that I'm not sort of dependent on an audience being totally on my wavelength. Whereas obviously online, one of the great sort of blessings of online work for me has been that I can talk about what I want to talk about, and my audience will find it or not find it. Like they'll either enjoy it, in which case great, and they'll share it, and that probably builds an audience for other people, or they won't, and then it just disappears. Then people just don't care about it. So it's sort of, I've been very lucky. I mean, I know, unfortunately, social media can be a cesspit for some people, and places like YouTube and you can end up with loads of horrible comments, and that can be very depressing. But I've been lucky that so far, touch wood, I've generally had quite positive reactions, and the occasional negative reactions I've had, I've just ignored or blocked or whatever, depending on how nasty they are. And that's meant that my experience has been quite nice. And so I think with online material, my feeling has always been you've got to do the thing that is quite niche to you, that is your thing. When you're doing live stuff, you sort of probably have to be a bit broader, but when you're doing online, you have to, because there's so many people doing it that why would anyone care about what you're doing unless you're making something that's really meaningful to you. And that's where I think political comedy works really well online, because, as I say, in front of I really feel like I've sort of learnt this through doing it, that when I was doing stand-up a lot before COVID and stuff, I would try and feed political comedy into my material, and it was much harder, and I'd get quite disheartened because it worked sometimes, and then other times the audience just weren't into it, and I could feel I wasn't sure. Whereas now with online stuff, people like it or don't like it, and if they don't like it, fine, they can go and watch something else.
And I never really thought about the core difference, obviously, because I'm not a comedian. It's the difference in how, when you do what you're passionate and what you love online, the audience with similar vibes will eventually find you. Like, the audience comes to you. Whereas when you go in front of a room of people, you don't know what their interests are, if they know anything. Like, I can't imagine what that must be like, because people have different senses of humor and stuff. And it's funny, because I was talking to Brittlestar about this too. Not everyone is on Twitter 24 hours a day tracking everything that's happening, whether it's politics or Elon Musk or any of those things. And so to be able to put your head into somebody else that, not everyone's a Twitter addict like we are, that's a huge difference. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because you just raised it a little bit, is the difference between the haters and the trolls in the, stand-up comedy world versus online. Like, online, if people are really horrible, you can just mute them, hide them, block them, and then it's like, you don't have to worry that the people that are your supporters and commenting and all that will be attacked by anyone terrible. But in stand-up comedy, it's live, unless it's a pre-recorded show, and you don't know who's in the audience. Do you ever get any kind of haters or hecklers or anything that, some comedians do?
I mean, I don't tend to, because my stuff is fairly sort of, I'm not being horrible. I'm not being very, very provocative or very aggressive with an audience. And so I don't tend to get people reacting like that. I mean, we're coming up towards Christmas, and Christmas season is sort of notorious amongst stand-ups, because it's tough, because you end up with lots of work parties celebrating Christmas, and they're often very drunk, and they can be very difficult to deal with. And it's always a bit of a kind of battle to keep their attention. But that's a different kind of feeling. That's I think the difference between online and live is quite big, because when you're in a live environment, particularly, if it's a comedy club, if it's a show, everyone knows what it is, then there's a huge amount of buy-in from the audience. Normally, the audience have paid to be there. They want to have a good time. They're out for their night out. It might be their birthday party, or they just want to see something funny. And so it would have to be pretty bad for them to kind of want to make it back. Now, Christmas shows, as I say, can be a bit different to that, because you end up with people who don't really want to be there. They've just been dragged along by their colleagues, and they get very drunk, or they get sort of aggressive, or they decide they want to sort of show off in front of their friends or colleagues, and that can be annoying and frustrating. But it never feels personal. It's just like, well, these people are just in the wrong place, and we'll do what I can. And I've spent enough time dealing with those audiences that I've kind of built up various tricks and skills to deal with that. And I don't enjoy it particularly, but I've kind of got the skills to do that in most cases. But yeah, the sort of the online abuse is much more, it's a mix, isn't it? Because on one hand, it feels more personal, because it's sort of coming to your personal place, your Twitter feed or your YouTube channel, whatever. But it's also in some ways just completely random. You don't know who these people are. They could be anyone from anywhere. They could be 10 years old, or 90. They could be from Russia or Canada or wherever. You don't know who they are, and you don't know what their perspective is or their background is. And you also, there's plenty of people who just do it for fun. They kind of wind people up for fun and try to kind of get a reaction from you. And so, yeah, I think you're right. You can just block them and move on normally, in my experience. But yeah, of course, if you get a whole load of it, and it's depressing and frustrating. And I've been lucky enough not to encounter it too much, occasionally a little bit, but yeah, not too bad.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's good to hear for anyone. I can't imagine what it must be like, because you're obviously there in the front. Like, I do public speaking, but I'm the one that's speaking. No one gets to say anything until I'm done, and there might be a Q&A. So in that sense, I don't really have to worry about people going, hey, get her off the stage or anything like that, unless they really hate what I'm saying. But the other thing I noticed, and why I'm really attracted to your content, is, and I don't know the stand-up comedy because I haven't been at your shows, but it's that I would categorize it as family friendly. You're not, swearing, you're not being racist and sexist and telling horrible, violent jokes and like all of the things that I think are disgusting about, the people who try to trigger the algorithm, so to speak, be as horrible as possible so that you'll get millions of followers. That would be an easy thing to do, but you kind of keep it really family friendly. And is that something that you intentionally did?
I think probably, yes, it did become that. Like, I think initially I didn't really notice, but then after a while I realized I wasn't really putting any swearing in or sort of, I guess, kind of adult content in that sense. Which I think that's basically a decision about the internet, is that, yeah, you may as well keep your audience as broad as you can. And people, it's funny because when I do stand up, I do swear, and I probably deal with more kind of, adult themes and sex and stuff. I talk about that sort of stuff on stage because that's more because that lands with that audience, with a sort of late night kind of comedy audience, in a way that it wouldn't necessarily do online. And then I occasionally share clips from my stand-up, and which will have a bit of swearing in it. And it's funny how some of my sort of followers react to that and go, I can't believe you're swearing. And I always just reply, well, there's a different context, like being in a live show is different to being on. And I wouldn't put loads of swearing in a sketch, but that's different from me saying, here's a clip from me online, live, but yeah, no, I think in terms of other content, yeah, I would hope I would never do anything kind of racist or homophobic or any of those sorts of, various things, misogynistic or whatever. Obviously there are times where you may be talking about an issue, but that doesn't mean that you're mocking it, and that can be confusing. And I think obviously there is this sort of, there is a question about whether people can sometimes take comedy too seriously, and sort of, if you're discussing something, that doesn't mean that you approve of it, or vice versa. It doesn't mean that you're attacking it. And so but that's not something that for me personally, it's not something, I mean, it's become a bit of a kind of running joke within the comedy world that whenever anyone does an interview, they're always being asked about, you know, cancel culture and how do you feel about
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it's always like, well, not that much really. Like it's like it doesn't necessarily affect you. Like it's you've got to make your own choices about whether what you want to talk about. And if you want, I suppose before cancel culture became a thing that people said, I would always find it funny or interesting or kind of ironic that the most offensive comedians, the comedians who kind of you know, push the line and deliberately try to be a provocative, and they would say that, they put that on their poster, you know, provocative comedian, seemed often to be the most thin-skinned when they're challenged or when someone says, oh, I don't really like that. And I always used to think, well, you can't have it both ways. Like if you're being provocative and challenging, great, well that's your thing, but you can't, you know, like being provocative suggests that you might provoke someone. You can't. And if someone is provoked by your provocation, that can't be a total surprise to you. You know, that surely that's part of the job, isn't it? That if you're, you know, if you've decided you want to be someone who's pushing the boundaries and stuff, sometimes you're going to step over the boundaries, and that's part of, you know. And I think that, and we're in this weird place now where I think it's true that there are certain subjects that are, you know, inverted commas, sort of uncomfortable, dangerous to talk about. But that's because I think that's often because people feel like, well, you're not approaching it in a sort of respectful way or in a sort of or from a position of experience. And so you can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but you've got to be aware that if you talk about it from a place of ignorance or a place of misunderstanding or just shock value, you know, being provocative for the sake of being provocative, then other people are going to disagree with you and are not going to enjoy that, you know, and then that will, you know, but luckily for me, I don't particularly broach those subjects live, and online I'm quite careful to, you know, talk about things that I think I understand. And if I get it wrong, then I'm happy to sort of say, okay, I think I got that wrong, but you know, I'm a comedian and I'm, you know, that's okay.
Exactly. It's like what you said, choices, you know, just be accountable for the things you say and how people are going to react and what you're doing. But I was also going to like follow up with what you were saying, because I often wondered, you know, you're doing this comedy, obviously there's the online, primarily politics, but people would know very quickly if you didn't know anything about politics, you know, because then it wouldn't be funny. It wouldn't be making sense. And I don't think you can know politics just at a superficial level either. You kind of have to be following issues a little bit. Is that something that you spend a lot of time doing? Because, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that you're a politician. Is, you know, but to be able to be funny about politics, you kind of have to know what's going on. And you do it for lots of different countries. Does that take up much time?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a politics junkie for, you know, since I was a teenager. Really, you know, I've always been interested in it and found it, an interesting thing to learn about. And I'm interested in history and politics and social sort of changes and things. And I listen to lots of podcasts about politics from various places, some American ones, some British ones. You know, I'd like to listen to ones about, you know, French or German politics, but I don't speak those languages, sadly. So I don't have the sort of the capacity to do that. And yeah, and you know, and I think Twitter and things like that, if you curate your Twitter feed so that you are seeing people who are interesting, then you get a lot out of it. I think, yeah, I think, as I say, I think I've learned to sort of trust my instincts a bit, that if I feel like there's a topic that I'm interested in, then I'll make something about it and put it out there. And I've definitely had a lot of experiences doing these videos that I sort of, there's definitely been a few experiences where I thought, I don't know if this topic is going to resonate with people. You know, I don't know if this is going to, maybe, is this just a thing I've noticed? Is this just a thing I'm bothered about? In which case, maybe this will, and often those are the ones that are most successful. You know, that there's something about making something that's quite specific. And this is something I've known for years in stand-up and through writing, and sort of, I don't particularly write narrative things, but I have done in the past a bit. That thing of, you know, the more specific you make something, the more general an appeal it has. And if you try and have, so if you write a story about some guy who goes to an office and has a job and has a family and has like, there's nothing in that. There's no, like, it feels very broad. Like, well, everyone does that. That's sort of half of the world lives like that sort of thing. But actually, there's no specificity to it. People aren't going to connect to that. Whereas if you write a story about a specific person who has a specific job in a specific place and has specific interests and problems, and that's what drama is. That's about, and then people can identify with that. And even people who have no connection to that person and live in a totally different country, have a totally different worldview, they can lock into that and they can kind of grab onto that and say that person, even though I don't identify with them, I can identify with parts of what they're going through, because everyone has, the sort of the human experience. And I think it's the same with comedy, that if you make something or satire or whatever, if you make something which has got a really specific point that you're trying to make, then people can kind of identify with it, can connect to that. Whereas if you just sort of do a general, all politics is bad or all politicians are evil or whatever, then it's too broad, it's too sort of cliched,
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's like the pros and cons to having politics as, comedy. I can only imagine, how you curate your Twitter feed, or I curate mine, a lot of law and politics. And of course, comedians like you who talk about politics, that would also attract all of the people who would be offended that you were talking about politics in a certain way. Like, you must get some responses from people who take it so seriously. Like your last video making fun of the lack of the red wave in the US elections. There must be people out there who respond to you and say, how dare you? The election was stolen. And of course there was a red wave.
As I say, I'm very lucky. I don't get that much of that. I think part of why I don't is because I'm quite upfront about what I think about stuff. So, and also the other thing the thing I've always done with my online videos is make them quite clearly comedy, like quite specific, like partly because I often have me talking to myself, so it's clearly like a sketch. Like, there's no, I'm not trying to trick the audience into thinking this is real. There are definitely other performers out there, like someone like Rosie Holt, who I'm a huge fan of, and she's great. I've been on her podcast and stuff, and she's brilliant. But what she does is a very different thing of sort of pretending to be a Tory MP usually, and then she sort of edits herself into TV programs, so it looks like she's doing the interview. So she finds an interview with a Tory MP which has been a bit weird or funny or something, and then she'll edit herself in and make it funnier and sort of add jokes. But she gets a phenomenal amount of people who don't know what she's doing, like just every and she's been doing it for a long time now. So I feel like I don't understand why there are just still constant, every time she puts a video out, there'll be dozens and dozens of people going, I can't believe you're an MP. I can't believe how this is disgusting. And you're making yourself look stupid. And she's very funny because she just sort of dead bats it all back and sort of says, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And doesn't sort of say, look, I'm obviously joking. But as a cursory glance at her Twitter feed would reveal that she's obviously a comedian. And yet that sort of, so she gets a lot of that anger that I think I would get if I was if I was trying to trick you into thinking these were real people on a real TV show, then maybe get a bit more of that. But yeah, I do occasionally get, I've definitely had a few on YouTube, a few sort of people who've come in and been very aggressively sort of right wing with me about stuff, or very aggressively sort of anti-vax or anti whatever. And I just tend to ignore them. I tend to just block them and ignore them. And because I know that there's no point engaging. I can occasionally engage a bit, but I normally think it's just, just one person. And if they don't like my stuff, that's fine. I don't have to. I'm not a politician. I don't have to impress people. If they don't like me, that's fine. Like,
you can basically say what you want. And I think that's great. And the other online thing is, I know there's a lot of crap online. There's a lot of hate online, but there's also a lot of not hate. There's a lot of cool people and there's a lot of supportive people. And our ability to just hide, mute, unfollow, block, that's so amazing. You can keep your content and the people who follow you relatively protected from the supreme haters. And
Yeah.
I think that matters too, because the people that comment or follow or watch also care if they're going to be attacked. Well, like watching your video and saying, "Oh, this was great," and then someone attacks them and says, "Oh, how could you be against the Republican Party or,
Yeah.
Boris or whoever else?" And the other thing I thought of all the different kinds of comedy that people do you find it relatively easy in this for political in the sense that you don't have to come up with the stupidity or the ridiculousness because politicians and the things they say and the things they do and governments, like all of that ridiculousness just falls in your lap?
I mean, sadly, yes. There's been a lot of that recently. I mean, Boris Johnson was obviously um, a sort of cartoon character in his own right, and he was always guaranteed to say something stupid if he was doing a speech. And so I've done, if you look back through my YouTube channel, you can see a whole bunch of videos I've done, which have basically been me taking the piss out of Boris Johnson, and that's been very easy. I did another one the other day because he did a speech at COP, and he's sort of back in the news briefly. And it is a bit harder with someone like a Rishi Sunak or someone who's a little bit more bland, and therefore harder just sort of immediately pick up on something that he's said. But yeah, the reality is we've got a lot of terrible politicians in the world, particularly in the Conservative Party in the UK. There's just a lot of very and the sort of a lot of very kind of unthinking or thoughtless or sort of very unable to express an opinion without it coming across as very sort of weird and mad and stupid. And really, I mean, I think Brexit has sort of fundamentally kind of broken UK politics in a way, and hopefully we might be in the next couple of years coming to a point where the Tories might lose the next election now, but it has just created this very strange atmosphere in British politics in a similar way, I think, that Trump did in America, but something slightly different. Trump is, a politician, whereas Brexit is this whole sort of thing. There's this sort of fantasy about what the world might be like or something. And there were so many different reasons why people voted for it or didn't vote for it. But what was clear from the beginning was that the people who were pushing it as an idea didn't have an idea really of what it was going to be. They just wanted to sort of break things and maybe change the world in some way. And actually the Liz Truss sort of debacle has proven that they, she had this very clear idea of what she wanted to do. She did it, and it really tanked the economy in a really serious way. And that whole period of the last sort of few months has just been amazing, just watching people behaving so recklessly and so sort of crazily with very serious repercussions. And in similar ways that Trump's did similar things in America in various ways, but we because of the way that the British system works, that if you are the prime minister, you have a huge amount of power. There are no checks and balances really. There's no if you're the prime minister of the parliament and you've got a big majority, you can basically do anything. And she did, and got immediately sort of destroyed by the markets and everything. And so, yeah, that whole period was very febrile, and it was, and I think it was fun to talk about because every day there was something else crazy happening. There was a new mad thing happening, a new person, and sometimes, yes, I mean, something I've kind of developed, I guess, is a style where I effectively listen to, I sort of make notes on what people have said, and then I make a sketch and I just sort of put some of those things into the sketch, and I don't clarify which bits are real and which bits are not, as it were.
Yeah.
And people often sort of say, "Hang on, did that actually happen?" And I have to go, "Well, that did happen, and that didn't happen." That line he did say that thing, that weird mad thing. He did definitely say that, And so sometimes the maddest things that are in the sketches are the real things,
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I do on my Twitch stream sometimes. So say something has happened, or, Liz has come out and made some kind of speech. So we'll watch the news clip of what happened, and we're all laughing going, "Oh my gosh, is this serious?" And then we'll watch your take on it. And I feel like you're saying not just the ridiculous things they say, but you're also kind of reading between the lines of what they really mean, but they're not coming out and directly saying it. Like, I find your sketches where you're the, media or journalist person asking the politician questions to be very telling, because the politician wouldn't say, oh, well, this is just for my own benefit, but that that's exactly what it is. So you kind of put, like, they didn't say that, but you're saying, well, this is what they're really saying between the lines. And I just find that so effective, and it shows that you actually like are following all of these political outcomes, and that's actually useful to people. I don't know how many of my Twitch streamers said, yeah, why aren't we a little bit more honest about what politicians say, but what they're really trying to do?
Yeah, and I think the thing I try to, I mean, I suppose that is part of the style I've built up, is the sort of get the politician to say. So again, it's slightly different to how some other people would approach it. Some other people would say, well, hang on, you're sort of breaking character, as it were. And I think I am breaking character as those characters. I am sort of saying out loud what I think they're thinking, and that's part of why it's obviously not real, like because those characters would never really say those things. But I am, as you say, I'm trying to sort of read between the lines a bit. And the thing I'm always trying to avoid, the thing I'm always trying to be careful of, is not to just be cynical, not to just assume the worst always, because that's easy to do. It's very easy to, and I find myself doing it sometimes. And I have to sort of try to row back on that, where I, to sort of go, well, obviously, just come up with the worst possible explanation of why they're doing this thing, because actually that is corrosive in the end. That's and I am worried about. I do worry about that. I think that it's funnily enough something I've been thinking about a bit in terms of maybe will make a sketch about it, but I don't quite know how to approach it, because I've listened to a few sort of focus groups recently, which were on various podcasts and things. And what's very clear is that there is this incredible cynicism amongst the general public, the voting public, about politics and about politicians. And you see this I'm sure you see it in America. I'm sure you see it everywhere in the sort of Western democratic world. There's a feeling of kind of, well, they're all in it for themselves, and also, and crucially, nothing we do will ever change anything. If we vote this way, it doesn't matter. I get that all the time on my sketches. People say, well, Labour are just as bad as the Tories, or the Democrats are just as bad as Republicans. They're all the same, really, in the end. And I understand where that's coming from. I understand but I think there's that sort of reflexive, corrosive cynicism is, I think, quite dangerous, because in the end, what it leads to is Trump and Brexit. It leads to sort of people going, well, they're all the same, so we may as well just give this guy a go, because he's sort of just as bad as the rest. He can't be any worse than anyone else. Or, well, we need to change things up, and then you end up with this sort of strongman thing of like, we need someone who's. There was that poll that was done a few months ago where people were asked, would you rather have a democratically elected leader who can't get much done, or would you rather have a sort of despotic dictator who gets things done? And increasingly people say they want the second. They'd rather have so. And what they don't realize, of course, is that they don't define what getting things done means.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, look at Russia, or Iran, or all sorts of places, or Turkey, or there's all sorts of places where you have people who get things done, but getting things done isn't necessarily a good thing. Depends who's getting done, and so it's. But I think there is. So I think there is a danger of just assuming everything's terrible, and assuming all politicians are the same, and that every motivation is bad, and so I have to. I am wary of being too cynical with that stuff, but I generally believe it. I generally think most people who I'm talking about are fairly cynical and are fairly sort of, and that's partly why with those sketches, I'm usually representing sort of a minister. I'm not specific about who I'm talking about. Sometimes I am, but quite often it's just like a general feeling of like, this is a general feeling that I have about the government, rather than attacking a specific person for a specific thing. And I think that is fair enough. But I think that is my if I have a sort of worry or a sort of feeling of like doubt about it, sometimes that's what I'm always worried about, is like not wanting to kind of sort of suggest that everything is terrible, because and I love I love it when people get in touch and say, oh, you've really cheered me up. I feel like
Yes.
this I was feeling really depressed and now I feel better. And I think that's
Mhm.
great. That's my job. That's lovely. But there is always a tiny part of me thinking, oh, is that bad? Like, is it better that those people stay angry? Do you know what I mean? Like, that thing of in the 30s and whatever, that there was a famous, like, I'll butcher the quote, but there's a famous quote from Peter Cook, who was, a genius in the 60s of comedy and satire, who said, satire is very powerful, as the cabaret artists of the Weimar Republic proved, as they stopped Nazism. And it's that sort of thing of like, yeah, of course, yeah, of course, it doesn't really do anything, and
Yeah.
there is an argument that perhaps it actually releases stress. That people sort of,
Mhm.
when they see satire and comedy about what's happening in the news, it makes them laugh and they think, oh, I've sort of feel better now, rather than going, I should change it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But that's a much bigger argument.
Those are things that I never would have thought of, like considerations. But I have to say, as an objective, UKer person, just watching your content, and like I read the news and stuff, that what's happening over there, I never get the sense that you're only criticizing, say, one political party, or that you're, being mean and attacking individuals. And I think the things that you say are fair, and I would wager the vast majority of it is probably true. And I think the thing that people like the most, I mean, at least the people I talk to about your stuff, is that you're saying what we all think, but we're not in all situations where we can say those things. And then you're wondering, am I getting politics right? Like, am I just missing everything? Are they really, really doing this out of the goodness out of their heart? Or in this particular case, is there something wrong with that? And I
Yeah.
think the fact that you're doing critical analysis could have the opposite effect of the bad stuff, and that it's actually opening people's minds to read between the lines, listen to what they're saying, compare that to their actions. How does that jive with what we want, how the issues we want addressed in the future, to protect human beings or
Mm.
protect the planet? And so I think it's another way of providing critical analysis in the non-media angry panel, where you put one conservative and one, liberal or Republican and Democrat, and they just fight and they talk over each other and you can't hear anything. And then you're like, you leave it and you say, well, and now I have no idea what this issue was. I have no idea who is advocating for the issue that I care about,
Yeah.
as opposed to party focus. So I find your kind of content would help also introduce, say, high school students to critical analysis. You don't have to be a jerk to say, maybe this is what's really happening behind the scenes. Let's check it out. So
Mm.
I think there's probably more good from your content. And then all of us poor political hacks who are addicted to Twitter and cannot like read their feed. That's also very stress relieving, because when you have to work in it, like I'm a professor in political science, so I have to work in it. And that does become depressing, when you see Trump, for example, or other things that are happening, to know that, okay, at the end of the day, I've got Matt Greene and he's going to be right on point. And that's just, yeah, okay, yeah, yeah. That's funny. It's not funny because it's true, but it's funny. And it is a stress reliever.
Good. Well, I'm very happy to hear that. I think that's the thing that I always think about in the end, is that in the end I'm a performer. Like, in the end I'm a comic, and I want to entertain and I want people to have a nice time. And I definitely have allowed some of my sketches to be funnier than others. There are some where I'm allow it, I sort of deliberately keep them fairly sharp rather than going just for the joke. I kind of,
Mhm.
I'm really trying to make a point here, so I sort of don't just go
Yeah.
for the joke. But 9 times out of 10, I am thinking, no, what's the funny thing here? What's the silly,
Mhm.
funny impact? And I think you're right. I'm hoping that I'm doing a bit of analysis too. And also, a lot of the time, my target is the media, really,
Yeah.
is the way that politics is is reported and promoted. And I was a huge fan of The Day Today, which is a sort of real classic of British comedy, and still stands up today, which is extraordinary because it was made probably 30 years ago now, nearly. And sometimes occasionally people say, oh, did you get that idea from The Day Today? And I'm sure I've been influenced by them, because they came out and they just made very clear. That was Armando Iannucci's first TV show, and he, who's now since made millions of great things. But they were the first British show to really sort of attack the media and sort of say, this is how ridiculous is TV news. How ridiculous is it that you have all these crazy graphics and mad presenters and correspondents who come in who don't know what they're talking about, and all that kind of stuff, and the speed at which everything moves. And at the time, there were moments in that felt like a parody and of something that didn't really exist, and now they totally do exist. Now the graphics have gone even worse than that, and so that is part of what I'm doing, is sort of trying to sort of point out the stupidity of the coverage, and the fact that for me, I mean, the thing you said about the the two people having an argument, I think that drives me mad. Like, I think that I can't watch a lot of political TV now. I don't, I just don't watch it. I watch clips of it and I sort of find funny ideas from it, but I don't sit down and watch it because I just find it too frustrating, because it is, as you say, it's just one person on the left, one person on the right, whatever, just shouting at each other. It's all heat, no light. And there's no sense in which anyone comes to any, people just get more and more siloed in their positions. And obviously polarization is this massive problem in American politics, and it's becoming more of a problem here. I think less so perhaps a bit, but it's certainly, still a big problem. And Brexit created a polarized society, but perhaps that's sort of fading a little bit, whereas I feel like in the States it's getting worse. But that idea that there's just this two people attacking each other and there's nothing good comes out of it, and I think that comes from this idea of balance that we have.
False balance.
British TV is regulated by a sort of government regulator, and they have this concept of balance, and it means that particularly the BBC, they tie themselves in knots about that, and they the idea that, well, if you talk about this, you have to talk about that, and if you have this opinion, you have to have that opinion, and it makes even the comedy on there, it can be quite uncomfortable, because you find people are sort of having to talk about certain things that maybe they're not that interested in, and that's again, that's what's great about online, is you don't have to I don't have to be balanced. I can do the stuff I'm interested in, talk about the things I'm interested in. Someone wants to talk about something else, that's fine, they can do that too. I don't have to be impartial, I don't have to be balanced. I try to be fair. I try to have done the research and done the reading a bit and thought about it, and I try not to be unfair to people, but I don't have to be balanced. I've got an opinion and I can stick to it, and that's quite refreshing, I think.
Ultimately, I think balance is a bit of a myth, unless you're like comparing different scientific studies, for example. Well, on the one hand, this study said this, on the other hand said this, but here's the pros and cons and here's the limits, versus putting someone up there who's a lawyer for human rights pitted with someone from a white supremacist organization. And you're like, wait, how is that balance? Racist, violent, wants to commit crimes, and a human rights lawyer. Like, there's just, that's not even comparable. So I think it's just like gone to such extremes, it doesn't do anyone any service. So I think everyone should just follow you. And throughout this whole interview I have been showing, here is Matt Greene Comedy's website. You can get a whole lot of information on there. This is his YouTube, my favorite, unless you're also addicted to Twitter, then you'll see most of his videos. This is his Twitter feed. Basically, if you Google Matt Greene Comedy or Matt Greene Comedian, all of his content's going to come up. And he's just such an amazing person. And, before we wrap it up, I just want people to know that in addition to being in front of the screen, you're also behind the screen too, as a writer and director. And I think that's some of the things that we wouldn't necessarily know about you. And so before we go, can you just talk a little bit about that? And because you must have a passion for it since you've been doing it for so long.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, I've been doing stuff in front and behind the camera and in front and off stage, all the way through my career. So it's been a mix of different things. I've actually this year done quite a lot of acting, which has been really great. Some TV work and various things that will be on over the next few weeks and months and years, I guess. And in terms of directing, yeah, I have directed a few sort of videos, and I've sort of worked on short films with people. And in a funny sort of way, I guess the videos that I make now are kind of, they're the culmination of all the different things I've learned, because I do all the stuff, you know, they are completely my work. I write, direct, produce, you know, perform, all the thing, edit. And I think that having that amount of control has been brilliant. I've worked on a few TV shows this year where it's been really nice to go back to a place of just being an actor on a set and sort of sitting on a set and watching dozens of people doing all the jobs that I'm effectively doing on my own at home. Has been quite a rare treat of just sort of sitting and watching, thinking, oh yeah, I'm affecting my own sound man and own cameraman, all those things.
Yeah.
Whereas you know, on the set there's dozens of people doing all these different jobs. And that's what's great about this business, is that you just never quite know where you're going to be from week to week. You know, I drive all around the country doing gigs, and I do shows in different places, and I make things at home, and then I go off and do acting work in different places. So it's yeah, if you keep, I found that if you just sort of keep making things and putting them out into the world, then that's the kind of, that for me has been the real lesson of the last few years, since sort of having to pivot to doing some other things because of COVID, is that sort of creativity has to be its own reward in a way that, and if you allow it to be its own reward, then it will also reward you in other ways. Like that sounds kind of weirdly spiritual or something, but it's sort of, but that is sort of true. I think that if you create, if you make things and put things out into the world, then that's its own, you know, that's its own pleasure, and you get pleasure from that and reward from that. But also people will see that and will find it. And
exactly. It's like a CV. You're putting out your, you know, CV to the world. Hey, if you like this, contact me.
And I think for years I would be working on the stand-up circuit thinking, you know, when am I going to get my big break? When am I going to get when is someone going to come and see me doing stand-up and think, oh, this guy's great, I'll put him on telly, or I'll put him in a radio thing or whatever. And, you know, and I did do some things like that, but it never felt like I was kind of getting the break, as it were. And people would always say to me, or I would hear people talking about, well, you've just got to find the thing you want to do and do that thing. And I would think, yeah, but I what is that? I don't know. I think stand-up's what I want to do. That's what I would do. But actually, I realized at the time, my audience was so small. You know, I was doing 100 people, 200 people, 50 people, 100, you know, and they were all mostly just people wanting to have a nice time. And so by the end of the night, they can barely remember their own names, let alone your name. So the idea that someone's going to walk away and think, oh, you know, that guy's, I must remember who he is, and I must put him in you know, do something with, it's just never going to happen. Whereas online, if you put things online, it stays, you know, they stay there, and then people can find them. And you found them, and I wasn't trying to appeal to people from Canada, but they're on the internet, so you know, you can find them, and that's been a real joy.
Oh, well, you know, that's awesome. And I think that's just the best way to look at anything in life. The more effort and passion that you put into things generally comes back around in some way. And I'm so glad to hear that you're working on these other projects, and that we might be able to see some kind of television series, or you know, any of those kinds of things that we can enjoy in a different context. Because obviously, from your short skits that you do on YouTube, obviously an actor, if you can portray all of these politicians and media journalists and everything else, I just think it's phenomenal. And thank you for taking so much time to have an extended conversation about all of this. I'm going to promote your content far and wide. We already do. We love it here. We're just like, everybody has to be on the Matt Greene comedy train, because who knows what's coming next. And it really is, you know, entertaining, educational, and we really appreciate your take, because I think most of us here, at least who are somewhat level-headed, are kind of on the common sense side of things, like you are, you know, like just kind of basics in life. And I really, really appreciate it. Anything that we can do to help support your work, you know, tag me in something or send me a message, and we can just shout it out to the world, so that the former colony can help you move forward in all of this stuff. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on.
No worries. Lovely to chat to you. And yeah, come and find me online. I'm on all those different places. And hopefully we'll keep making videos until someone makes me stop. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Elon Musk, perhaps. Who knows?
Maybe Elon Musk will blow up the internet and then, we'll have to find something else to do.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you to all of the listeners, all of the watchers, all of the supporters. Make sure you support content creators of all kinds. Support artists in whatever way you can. And nowadays, even more effective than money is likes, comments, supports, shares. Any way you can trigger the algorithm for the good people, that's the best way to support online content creators. So thank you again, and can't wait to see your next video.